we get started?
We may as well.
Okay. All right, let's get started. So our speaker today talk to her at pizza. She'll be here for an entire another month, and you should have time to be able to talk to her then. So Margaret got all three of her degrees at the University of Western Australia. Did I get that right? And so she started out in getting her PhD in ecology, and then she went back to school after getting her PhD for landscape architecture. So she's done a lot of work pulling in ecology concepts into her landscape architecture. So it's a little bit like Peter. I think we'll have lots to talk about later. But so she's here also to talk about Wilson, and his beautiful photographs in Australia, because apparently nobody knows that he went to Australia and collected and took a lot of photographs. So I think she's one of the first people to actually dive down into these photographs, and probably the first person to have seen them in many, many years. So she's going to be spending most of the rest of the month doing that, but in the meantime, she's going to tell us about her work.
Thanks very much, Faye. Faye asked me also to talk a bit about landscape architecture and how I teach it as an ecologist, teaching in design faculty, where I've been since 2007. So I'm here and talking about Wilson's Another Planet, and it's really referring to southern Australia. There are lots of aspects about the tropical north of Australia which probably don't so much apply to what I'm going to say. But so why am I here, and how did I get to here? So I've got this picture of Australia focused on the western half. The western half is the part where there's this massive flora that is really fabulous. So I'm going to focus on that. And here's a photo to prove that we have beautiful flowers in Australia. This is a friend's sheep station after some fairly good rains. It's about in the middle of Western Australia. And that it would be hundreds and hundreds of kilometres like that after a good year. So Wilson went to Australia in 1920-21. It was an expedition to Australasia, India and Africa, and it was really looking at gardens. But what I found interesting is when he spent a lot of time, a huge focus in Western Australia, and that's when he went actually out into the bush. He wasn't looking at botanic gardens. So he actually said, and he wrote in his book, The Smoke That Thunders, and I really like this, to a visitor from the Northern Hemisphere, no matter how familiar he or she may be with the forest scenery of the North, Western Australia is a new world, and it might well be another planet. And it is absolutely different. And when I first went to live in England in the 1990s, my colleagues were astounded because they asked me, what do you think of England? And I said, it's such a young country. And they did not expect an Australian to say that. And they were quite taken aback that I should think that they came from such a young country. But I come from such an old country, such an old landscape, and it has completely different flora. So Wilson went there in late October 1920, and that's an interesting time to visit in terms of the season, because October it's starting to really warm up in this part of the world. And that was of particular interest to me. Now, here is a picture I managed to get from the Australian National Library about Widgymultha, which is a place where Wilson collected, and I'll show you where it is in a minute. But it's a really remote country, and I was talking to Ned a while ago, and he said it's not as remote as being in China, but you're a long way away from any services, you're a long way away from people, even though you might be on tracks. And so what my project here is to look at the diaries that Wilson wrote, and there's a limited number of diaries, and to look at the images. And I've already found there's about 240, 250 images that are definitely Australian. Some preceding them have been digitised from India, and then suddenly we're in New Zealand, because he did a tour of Australia, went to New Zealand and went back to Australia, went to Tasmania, which is quite a curious thing to do. But I'm also looking at herbarium specimens in Harvard and herbarium specimens in Western Australia and in Victoria. And he lodged a lot of specimens in Western Australia, and he's got a number of specimens lodged here in Harvard as well, which have been digitised beautifully. So where he's spent most of his time, and I just wanted to focus on this a bit, is here in what's called the Great Western Woodlands here, this region here, and this is where we are. The Great Western Woodlands, look here we have the Great Victoria Desert, the Nullarbor Plain. These are really sparse areas. The Nullarbor Plain is exactly what it says, Null Arbor, no trees. I used to think it was an Aboriginal name when I was a little girl, and then I realised that the Latin. So Wilson's major time is spent here, and the other thing about the Great Western Woodland is it's virtually an island. Because here we have the Southern Ocean, we have what is now the West Australian wheat belt, which wasn't as extensive in 1920. This is wheat sheep country, and it's been extensively cleared. It's a very fragmented landscape, and farmers are really starting to try and defragment that landscape now, but it's hugely changed. And then this incredible wheat belt area, this whole region is in the southwest Australian floristic region, which is one of the great floral regions of the world. And it's also a hotspot because of the fragmentation. So I also I was talking to Lisa last week, and I'll just make a little comment here about some of the place names that Wilson went to, and Lisa almost got the giggles because Kalgoorlie, Coolgardie, Cunderdin, these are all Noongar, this is all Aboriginal language names that have, and all through this area it's very strongly named after what the local people called things. So Merredin, Norangarup, Nannup, Boyanup, Kojonup, and there's 100 others. But in particular, what's happened in Western Australia was the Noongar language was taken up by the common names for major trees in particular. So it's these are household words: Jarrah, Carry, Marry, Moich is Les, but Tuit, Mottleka, and Moona, which is in Melaleuca, and Balga, which is Xantheria pricei. Now this is something which I'll show you a bit of today. But so these are all the major eucalypts, and I'll just say that Marry was a eucalypt until about 15 years ago, and it was reclassified as Corymbia, but it's part of the family. So Wilson went into this landscape with all these lovely names, and the Great Western Woodland itself, which I've seen a lot of these slides are in the Great Western Woodland, the images he took in 1920, and it's the largest intact temperate woodland in the world, and as you can see here, 30% of Australia's eucalypts, 20% of Australia's flora, and it's largely intact, and that is a big difference between it and the landscape to the west of it, which has been so highly fragmented. This is bushland, and if you take the Indian Pacific train and go through from Perth to Sydney on the east coast, you can travel through here, and you're travelling through a woodland, and it's a very beautiful woodland too. And I like this photo which I pulled out because I'm not sure who the man is here, but behind is a Model T Ford, a Model T Ford Tourer, and there's a couple of photos with the Model T Ford in it. And it's pretty remarkable in 1920-21 to be travelling in this country in a car like that. It's remote now, and people only go into this country now with their Toyota Land Cruiser fully loaded with their GPS tracker, etc., etc. So this great richness of flora was recognised by him as another planet. Next one. And this is another view. So he spent quite a few weeks in this landscape. So it's actually very, very beautiful. It's about 2,400 floral species. It's also got incredibly high endemism in reptiles. And the southwest of Australia has also a reptilian biodiversity. I grew up in this sort of landscape and was very familiar with lots of snakes. Always saw snakes in the bush in summer, and lots of geckos, lots of goannas, and yes, some of them are poisonous. So this is an intact system today. Now, I just want to say something about myself because I have an unusual double background, and how did I get here? And Faye gave me a bit of an near the city of Perth, and there's not all that much left of it now because we've been very careless with it. But this is, I just want to point out to you too that This is the open canopy, typical of eucalypts. So here we have Eucalyptus gomphocephala and a Banksia menziesii, named after Menzies, the botanist, and of course Banksia, named after Joseph Banks. So this was it's very familiar to me. And if you looked in the opposite direction to this, you'd see the Indian Ocean. And again, here's the city of Perth, sitting in what looks like a wonderful botanical area, but Perth has spent a lot of time in the last 40 years in particular cutting down clear-felling its coastal plain of the Banksia woodland. It's commonplace, so you get rid of it, and it's huge suburban expansion. It's gone from probably a city of about 200,000 people in 1940 to 1.2 million now. And Australians love having a house. Which is understandable, really. But so look, I did my agricultural science degree, and that is a degree with a human culture, and it taught me really about biology in association with the human culture, and I think that was important for later going on to landscape architecture. And my PhD was ecophysiology of Banksias, and I spent a lot of time looking at the Proteaceae, but in response to drought and in disease. And then I went on, I did postdocs at Oxford and postdoc at Cambridge, where I was working in mathematical biology, and I felt I was getting further away in some ways from plants, but I went back and to a challenge in a way. I've always been pulled between the sciences and humanities, and I went back and did a degree in landscape architecture, and for the last, then I was working in practice, but for the last 10, 11 years I've been teaching at the University of Melbourne. And the challenge is teaching students in landscape architecture, and I know Peter is here today, probably has got the same sort of challenges. I very much teach theory to students because I think theory is the thing that really drives us intellectually, and it gives us ideas, and taking ideas from science that we can use in design. And my emphasis has always been on plants and water. And so, this is a book I wrote last year and published last year, which is quite a theoretical book. It's laying theoretical concerns for studio. But I also very much teach students that a lot of landscape design students have an understanding that science is all pure empiricism. We all go out and spend our time measuring beetles, bugs, and whatever. So I'm trying to tell them that science is not all empirical, and it's also driven by qualitative ideas, such as the incredible ideas of Darwin, which are basically qualitative ideas, and conceptual ideas. And so I'm trying to work with them to establish foundations for studio. And fundamentally, how can landscape architects use the ideas that scientists deliver to us, and how can we use those facts? I'm just sort of putting that as a background. I'll come back to that. But, oops, next slide, is that one? But I wanted to say, as a result of also growing up in the bush on the west coast, I had a huge interest in the exploration of Australia, the botanical exploration of Australia in particular, and the botanising that went on. And so here we have what was, in the early 1600s, Western Australia had been mapped, mid-1600s, this drawing is. And one of the noticeable things is that I can't really see from here, but you can see New Holland is the name of it, and all these Dutch names, Van Diemen's Land, Groot Land up here. Peter Nooit's is a captain along here, Nooit's Land, and the Dutch were exploring. And what I also found when I was reading Wilson's book, The Smoke That Thunders, I was really quite surprised because he knew a lot of the history of the exploration of Western Australia. And in particular, he knew a story which I think many West Australians don't know and many Australians don't know. And that is, how did Western Australia come to be discovered? And really, it occurred in 1610 when there was an admiral in the Dutch East India Company. And of course, I'm not sure how familiar you are in North America with the Dutch East India Company, but they were going, based in Cape Town and based in Holland, of course, and going from Holland up the east coast of Africa, a route that had been established by Vasco da Gama and the Portuguese, across to Sri Lanka and across to Batavia. But in 1610, the Admiral Hendrik Brewer had noticed that the very strong winds were blowing eastward, and when he left Cape Town, he then had command of 2 ships, and he sent one ship the normal route, and another ship he sent going eastward, and discovered that he got to Batavia 6 months earlier. And money was time is money. But the interesting thing about that is that they had to dead reckon longitude, because of course they didn't have longitude until the 17th century, mid-1700s. And obviously Western Australia was discovered when captains overshot their area. And so we have these incredible wrecks along this coast, but the first people who went ashore were just really looking at the country and not particularly botanising. One of the first people who made some comments about the vegetation in the area where I grew up. This is only very, very close to where I grew up. This is Macrozemia ridleyi, and was in 1696, William de Vlaming came to this shore, and he was looking for survivors of a wreck. There are 302 people who had perished or were missing. So, and he made this area, became a rendezvous for Dutch ships. And that's pretty important because they ended up navigating and annotating the whole of the coast. But the first person who actually came and botanised in Australia and deliberately botanised was William Dampier, and I've just been talking to Ned about him. So William Dampier was the first European who actively set out to record the flora of Australia. And he was an amazing person. He was a very colourful figure, as we say. The Spanish regarded him as a terror, as a pirate, but to the British he was a privateer, a very subtle difference apparently. He was a hydrographer, sometimes a naval officer. He was court-martialed. He was the first person to circumnavigate the globe 3 times in 1660s, 1680s. And he earned from his privateering, he earned about £22 million in those days, and subsequently lost it. His ship was the one who also picked up Alexander Selkirk, who's known for Robinson Crusoe fame. And after he lost his money, he wrote a book, fortunately, which he hoped to establish his fortune again, but it didn't. But he was very influential. Not only did he look at the tides and influence James Cook, the great navigator, and Horatio Nelson, but his collections of plants influenced Darwin and Wallace and also Sir Joseph Banks. And he was the first person to coin the expression subspecies. And he was also the first person to coin the expression chopsticks and barbecue. So, so a very interesting person. So subsequently, early explorers, they recognised this incredible diversity and strange plants. And this is Banksia coccinea, which is really well known in Australia because you can imagine these long stems with a beautiful flower on top, and they're everywhere in the cut flower trade today. And that's something that's happened in the last 30 years. And this is a painting by Ferdinand Bauer, who's a great Austrian artist, a botanical artist, and he painted this a long way. I mean, this is 1801, and that's the painting in 1813. It took him 12 years. 12 years later, he finished the painting. But interesting to me, he painted by numbers. So this, I've seen the annotation of this with hundreds of numbers on it. So these early botanising in Australia helped to establish this concept that it's a really unusual flora, completely different to anywhere else. And I've just put some of the most important ones for you. There's Sir Joseph Banks travelling with Cook, with Captain Cook, on the Endeavour, and La Baladière with D'Entrecasteaux in the Recherche and the Espérance. A lot of French names also in the West Australian coast. And Menzies, a great botanist travelling with Vancouver, who's much more well known in North America. Perron, travelling with Bourdon in the Geographe and the Natural East. You've got 2 capes in the southwest of Australia named after the ships. And Robert Brown is a very, very famous botanist in Australia, annotated a lot of the Australian flora. And I put Good the gardener there because the gardeners also went and were often forgotten about, but they were the people who got the plants they collected back to England safely, and sometimes a living plant as well. And in Good's case, he died on the voyage, as did, let's see, half of that crew. D'Entrecasteaux died of scurvy, several people, a lot of people, and Good died of on the voyage as well. So these were really distant voyages to a distant place and really very dangerous. So Good has a whole family named after him, which is a bit of a nice thing. And I might also say, I thought to put here, there are a lot of early English botanists in Australia in the early years of the colony. Sydney was founded in 1788. And convict botanists from Sydney. And something that a lot of even Australians don't know is that 25% of the convicts to Australia were political prisoners. And I bet no one else in the room knew that. And a lot of those people were sort of quite gentlemen. They had quite a good education. They were natural historians. And as well, amusingly, quite a few of the early convicts were counterfeiters. And counterfeiters are really good artists. So it's very, very funny. So now I think one of the things that was always very noticeable and everyone commented about when they were on these great tours of exploration was the strange colour of the Australian flora. And so here's one of our poets from early 20th century saying it's a nation of drab green and desolate grey in the field uniform of modern wars. And so I was really interested some years ago saying, well, just how different are the colours? Because I felt as a landscape architecture question, when people are planting exotic trees, are they actually changing the colour of Australia? And can it be really determined? Can you actually assess colour? Because I think it's a fascinating thing. We always think of it as something that can't really be assessed. But the answer seemed to be yes. So what I did was I looked at hundreds of samples of a whole lot of species. And here's something from Sydney. This was a long while ago I was doing this. But I hunted around for a scheme to do this. What I also found interesting is that the Horticultural Society colour schemes from Britain and Europe didn't have the greens I needed for Australia. But the natural colour system of Sweden did. And so which is quite curious. But the Swedes have done a very sort of mathematical thing. This is just one of the book is about that thick. And this is something which is green, 50% green and 50% yellow on this particular one. So I looked at all these flora and I did in fact find that Australian endemics were statistically greyer. And what that means is, well, there's white here, chroma here, which is brightness, and S shorts for blackness. So I found that they were actually greyer, less chromatic and darker than exotics. And that was massively statistically significant. So I had many sort of ways of looking at this. And here's, I think I've got the top there. I can't even read what it is from here. But what I did also, I looked at their trunks. And so someone did say to me, did you assess the percentage of colour in the trunks? And there's no way, that would be another thing. So I just recorded every colour that I could find. And there's some eucalypts here and some exotics. So they certainly did have a shift. And what was interesting was I published this in Landscape Architecture Journal. The graphic designer got really excited about all these colours and wanted to put a Jacobs colour coat of many colours around them. And I said, no, this is actually being worked out carefully. The other thing I really liked about this work is that I found eucalypts that had the colour blue in them, and it really was a blue, and it was a colour blue that the Swedish said was never found in nature. So I thought, yes, one to Australia there. And it is reinforcing the fact that it is another sort of planet. So what I do in landscape architecture, I just want to return to this, my push to teach ecology for design. And what is happening in landscape architecture now, there is not quite a revolution, but the beginning of a lot of change in landscape architecture, where I call it going wider, going out into disciplinary territories, and going in deeper, more rigorously into the science, because landscape architecture needs to have more science and more scientific understanding into it. And so what I'm doing is translating the scientific ideas for my design students. despite saying that, this is really important, the story of information in the sciences is still largely ignored in landscape architecture academic discourse, and that's something that is a problem. So my next book will be about that. Now, part of the way this is happening can be seen in the way designers are now doing some of their renders, and this isn't universal, but we're actually starting to put in what is a process here rather than just a pretty picture, and that is a major shift from having a render that looks lovely to actually saying this is how this whole thing works, and it's starting to pull in the science. So the question to myself is my challenge of teaching science to non-scientists, and I'll just put this in context. Most of my students in my master's subject are late 20s, early 30s. They haven't done any science since they were 14 or 15, and they hated it. So it was a real challenge. So I looked at my own background and took inspiration in some ways from something that happened to me. I was at school a pretty indifferent physics student. I wasn't really interested in the 86-kilogram man on travelling at 40 kilometres an hour on a trolley and how fast when he made an impact. I really didn't care. And so this push-pull physics didn't really excite me at all. And so when I started agricultural science, I was horrified in second year to discover that I had to do a subject called soil science, which was fantastic, but half of it was going to be soil physics. And I was dreading this, but the lecturer walked in and he drew something like this on the board, and these were soil particles. And then he asked two simple questions. How does water move through the soil? And how does how does a plant get that water? And so suddenly this was, physics became a friend of mine. And surprisingly, it would have really surprised my physics teacher at school to know that I used physics in my honours thesis, in my PhD, and when I was working at Cambridge. And but the important question, the thing about this was that these were important questions. And so I've tried to learn from this about my students and teaching students landscape architecture. What are the important questions? Putting it in context. Also, these are spatial questions, they're biological questions, they're physical questions, they're probably chemical questions as well. And it's all about actions, because the plants, water is flowing and plants are seeking things. So I've also, in my teaching, I sort of pull out the action verbs that landscape architects do and all the processes that we need to deal with as we're designing. And some of these are, like messing things up for children's play and not just having everything all neat and tidy. Exposing rivers, for example, which is in the United States is doing that quite a bit. I've got one down here, where is it? Restituting is somewhere down there, and it's really giving, down here, it's really giving a river, for example, giving a river back its floodplain. So, and this all influences, we have the question of, what plants do you plant too? So this is botany plus water in a lot of these questions. So in doing all this, here we are. I take students out, so we do all sorts of things. This is some students working in studio, working on a suburban charrette, and they've been posed an ecological question of how do you design a suburb, taking into account perhaps something that's really important to be saved, or something that's really common that needs to be saved. We go into the field, and we've gone into the field with practitioners, and here we're looking at a constructed wetland. Here we're in the Little Desert National Park just this year, with a ranger looking at a very unusual bird that builds a mound, and it's endangered, and it's a very fragmented landscape. So it's looking at big spatial issues of botany as well. And this is something I do with my students also. I take them into engineering lab, and we look at water and water flow. So I'm very much using all my background really with where I am at the moment. But another planet focus is also something I talk about to my students a lot, because how do we design when we're in a different landscape? And one of the important things is that a lot of the literature that we are exposed to is from North America or Europe, And if you're a North American, you don't perhaps really appreciate how much you dominate the world's literature. But one of the things I'd say to students, is that really relevant to us? Because a lot of things, it might be relevant, might work in Montana, it might work in Sheffield, it might work in Germany, but is it really relevant to Australia? So I do go through some of the most simple things. We are in Australia one of the global megadiverse countries, and what does that mean in terms of being a designer? Is there a responsibility there to really think about our flora? And there are two, and I'll just keep going because there are two major hotspots, the southwest Australian floristic region, which is a hotspot, and the eastern forests. And these are very fragmented and with high population growth. Australians love their coast because a lot of us, I'll say basically all of this is desert. So we've got these major areas here. We also, I'll just go back to that last one and just say something about that too, is that one of the things I was talking about to Ned about was that Wilson went in 1920 and a lot of this landscape hadn't been removed for agriculture. So that's something that's going to be very interesting to see. And the other thing is that the 19th century had a lot of foresight and put aside a lot of land. In the 20th century, we didn't put aside any land. And we've, in the early parts of the 20th century, and we've lost a lot of vegetation and wonderful places. So the other thing is there's an incredible high endemism, and the major genera, which I'm sure a lot of you know, is the eucalyptus, which is also now broken into Corymbia and Angophora. There's about 900 species, and I've had visitors from Britain, for example, come and visit me, and they've thought that, oh, where is the eucalypt? And so I've broken it to them slightly that I don't know all my eucalypt species because I'm not a taxonomic botanist as such, but there's a lot of them. And acacia and banksia and melaleuca are some of the major ones. So the eucalyptus is from the Greek, it's well covered, and this is its famous little bud cap here, which when we were kids we used to collect, and you can put a pin through them and you make a necklace with them. So this is Eucalyptus macrocarpa, mottleka, which is absolutely glorious, and Wilson obviously thought so too because here he collected it. And Lisa Pearson told me that he did this sometimes in China as well, put something in a vase to particularly show it off. So morphologically, there's a huge number of differences in eucalypts, from really shioki looking things to this is a big leaf, as you can see, it's approximately 6 inches. Here's a sandplain eucalypt, again a very different colour, but opposite leaves and just a big sprawling shrub that might be about 8 foot tall when it gets to its maximum. And what I love about these particular eucalypts is that virtually every little group, there's a spider here, spider here, spider here, all making their little homes in these little bits of the eucalypt. Then the other great genera is acacia, of course, and this is taken from Kings Park and Botanic Gardens when the acacia were in full flower. Things flower winter and early spring in this part of the world, so try to avoid summer because everything closes down. A lot of things close down in summer. And a different morphology again from really enormous range of the acacias. My favourite are the banksias, and here are some prostrate banksias growing again in Kings Park, and different forms, a whole lot of different colours, different leaf shapes and all sorts of things. Here you can see the inflorescences. And you see a young one. I can't quite see where I am here. There's a young one coming up here. This one's developed, another one down there, and there's an old head down here. What often happens to them is that when they get opened up by fire or when they just get to a certain stage, they will open up and the seeds are held very closely. But when they're closed, you'd need a jackhammer to get them open. You cannot get those seeds out, and some of the species require a fire to be opened. So again, different leaf types, and yet the interesting thing about this one is that there's a fossil from Antarctica that if you looked at it, I would say it was Banksia speciosa. So it's 50 million years old. So Banksias are also, they're also large trees. Now the other thing is that we have a very sclerophyllous vegetation. I always find that a very hard word to say. Very, very prickly, but it's very common vegetation type. And this Dryandra here it was originally called Dryandra, is now classified as a Banksia, is incredibly prickly. And Wilson also collected some of these. It's a very prickly Melaleuca. And this is near Bruce Rock in October 1920, and it's in the herbarium. And I must say, the herbarium specimens are so beautiful. It's amazing. The other feature of Australia and southern Australia and most of the country is very low nutrient soils. It's a very old landscape, so it's highly leached. We have low pHs, very low levels of phosphorus in particular, nitrogen and potassium. And we have these specialised root structures. These are called proteroid roots or cluster roots on a hakea. And I think it's important too that they resent European practices. So I still hear, garden shows say, put a whole lot of manure in your garden. I think, well, as soon as you say that, you're not going to be able to plant Australian native plants because they don't like it. So you have to be very careful and just really do nothing is the thing. So the capacity for low nutrient is really keenly investigated, as I've got here, by crop scientists. So some of the things I also talk to my students about is to understand how Australia was climatically buffered in the last 50 million years. It's separated from Antarctica, and extraordinarily, as it sort of went north, the climate was changing almost with it, and it became also buffered by the Southern Ocean circumpolar current, which modified the climate. So when we have a lot of the Gondwanan linkages across southern connections, and some remnants too. This is one of the very few deciduous trees in the whole of Australia, and I think Wilson went down to have a look at them. This is a southern beach. So I also talk to my students because I think it's really good for them to know what scientists do and what gets scientists excited, and they always seem amazed when a scientist stands up and he's really excited about something. They love it. So I make sure that they understand, some of the things are happening, what was happening climatically. Here, Australia's isolated, and you can see the incredible speciation in the Banksias. Now, another point of aridity was one of the major things driving speciation. And I've got, here's a very simple image of these stomata that are really sunken. And to me, these are normal stomata, but I'm sure perhaps to you they don't look quite normal. I'm not sure. But they're often very, very hairy too. And this is a Banksia. And a lot of the species have very hairy abaxial surfaces protecting against desiccating winds. And so the other thing I tell a story about the aridity in Australia, and we really don't know how arid the country can be. Some years ago when I was an agricultural science student, in fact, I came across a story written by an anthropologist, and in a way too, this story is an example where someone in one discipline didn't sort of think about what it was telling them for something else. And the story was a corroboree story from Western New South Wales, but it's an area that's now an agricultural region. And in the tribe, the men were out hunting, the women were out gathering, and water began to fall from the sky. And no one in the tribe had ever seen water falling from the sky before, and they were terrified. Water was something that you dug a hole in the ground for, and you found it. So water falling from the sky was like the end of the world. They all rushed back to camp, and then finally the oldest man in the tribe came back, and he said, "Don't be afraid. When I was a little boy," the oldest man in the tribe then said that when he had been a little boy, water had sometimes fallen from the sky. And I think if I were an agricultural scientist in New South Wales, I'd be really terrified of that story, because it makes us think that there's a 50, perhaps a 60, 70-year-old long drought. But we don't know really what the country is capable of, except perhaps with another story about aridity told to me by a farmer. He said he'd had a 7-year drought on his property and he was very depressed, and he went for a walk and found himself walking in bushland. And he looked up and he thought, what the hell? Because the eucalypts were all flowering, and there were young eucalypts coming up that were probably only 2 years old, and even one that was only 1 year old, and the drought had been going on for 7 years. And he was a very smart farmer, and he said, what have they got in them? What's the genetics they have that allows them to not be bothered by a 7-year drought? And then the next question was, could he get it, put it in his crops? And I think it's very, very interesting, the aridity. We had a long drought in Melbourne for 13 years. And one of the eucalypts, only in the last 2 years of it, a big 200-year-old eucalypt started to open up slightly. And as soon as it rained, it closed. So it was starting to notice it. Another factor in the Australian environment is fire. When the Europeans arrived, one of the first things they did was to stop Aboriginal people from burning. And the early explorers recorded that Aboriginals were always burning the land, and it was a way of managing this landscape. Most of the plants are flammable. If you see a eucalypt going up in flames, it actually explodes, a bit like when you strike a match, it goes up. Many plants need germination, need fire to germinate, or they need smoke to germinate. And if you want to germinate Australian plants more easily, so I've lost my microphone, more easily you can actually put them in smoke water, and that was something that was worked out in Western Australia. But it's not really known how much, to what extent fire has influenced speciation. But I wanted to, if I've got time, I hope I can still, got a bit of time. I talk about this fire. This was a fire in what we called Black Saturday. It was very different from your Black Friday. Very, very different. Black Saturday on the 7th of February 2009 in Victoria, and for a couple of decades other firefighting units had been telling the Victorians in the state of Victoria that you needed to burn, because they had a colossal amount of fuel load in their forests. And so this all went up on a Saturday. It had been incredibly hot through October, November, December, January. And when I say hot, it was 48 degrees. That is, what is that in Fahrenheit? 112, 115? I'm not quite sure what it is in Fahrenheit. I'm sorry, I cannot think in Fahrenheit anymore. And 180 people died. So that was a real learning lesson. And since then, there's been a lot more, virtually going back to Aboriginal practices of burning bush. So questions arising for landscape architects of how we work with these global differences, how we work with another landscape, another planet. What are the global differences? And so one of the things these are sort of some of the things I talk to about with my students. And one of the questions I ask them is something to do with Godfrey Hewitt proposed some years back that looking at Europe, there's northern purity, the big northern forests of single species, or only a few species, and the southern richness of places like Greece and Italy and Spain, where there's a richer, more mixed flora. But I actually took that and sort of looked at that in terms of the northern hemisphere purity and southern richness in the southern hemisphere. And taken it as a question is, can we use this? And this is an example of in North America where here they've done just a couple of species, and he was actually definitely picking up the glaciation idea. In contrast, Australia was hardly glaciated at all. There's just one area, or two areas really, and this is in New South Wales, the Kosciuszko National Park. Who I was just saying to Ned, Kosciuszko is the same man who's in your Boston Commons. There's a statue of him, I was amazed to see that. So this is a glaciated area from a little bit of ice age in Australia. And in this area too is the only place where virtually pure stands of eucalypts came in after the glaciers left. And this is the snow gum, which is a lovely, lovely tree. It's a very, what you call it, a social tree. It likes growing in copses. And it's got an absolutely gorgeous bark, which everyone goes to photograph. And so you have students throwing snow in it to make it look gorgeous. So this would, I think, grow in Boston, but we have a discussion about that. So the other thing is exotic plantings in Australia are have more negative impacts than in the Northern Hemisphere. I mean, one of the reasons is we have birds that like this little wattle bird here, which are totally adapted just for Australian flora, and they can't do anything with the hibiscus or anything with anything else but the Australian flora. So exotics are not benign, and landscape architecture a few years back was always just a matter of preference. You know, do you like exotics or like this? Or so I try to impress upon I shouldn't say impose. I try to impress upon my students that there are real biological differences here. So we also, climate is shifting in southern Australia to probably a drier climate, and which plants do we use? Our parks are in trouble in many cases, where our trees are now planted in the 1860s, 1880s, say in Melbourne. They are really suffering. The drought we had, it was extraordinary because all the parks, it would be like every tree you can see in the Arboretum had a big plastic tank next to it with feeding it water. And that was for years that was going on. And it was almost like a cheer when the weather changed in 2013 and the plastic pots were taken away. But we still lost quite a few deciduous trees, and they often lost they shed a lot of their leaves during the summer because they couldn't cope with the load of the heat and the dryness. And by the way, we have in Melbourne a lot of English elms. So if you want to see hundreds of English elm, our quarantine services are to thank for that. The other thing we impress upon our students, and it's very important in terms of botany as well, Australia has the oldest Indigenous knowledge and wisdom. It's still a living tradition and a very strong tradition. So this living culture, which we are more and more engaging with, is teaching us more about rethinking country, what plants like, how they behave, how we can use plants, and what the history of planting is. We've come to realise that the Aboriginals actually altered their environment enormously and managed their environment and created what we refer to now as kangaroo hunting grounds in many cases. So also just a little thing like a re-evaluation of plants possible for wider food sources. There are hundreds of species that Aboriginals use for food, which are not used at all, but this is starting to come in Australia now. So there's lots and lots of species out there that we don't know their properties to. A lot of medicinal species as well. And so this is an important point for us, is that this is indispensable teaching now in landscape architecture. And so, when I've been up in the high country of Australia, he's an Indigenous elder called Rod Mason. He's very well known, and he actually told the students a story about his tribe, how when the climate got really, really cold a long while ago, they went off to blah, 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 and some of my students were standing near me, and they suddenly said, "He's talking about the last ice age, isn't he?" And we said, yes, so this is a story that predates the last ice age. And in fact, Rod's tribe actually moved from here right through to here. And so another thing is that it's teaching us also, we think of refugia in terms of plants, but this is also refugia in terms of human beings, when Australia did lose a lot of its population during the last ice age. So, and the other thing I talk to my students about is they're increasingly interested in working at large scale, to work in large scale restoration projects and fragmented landscapes, which a lot of fragmented landscapes in Australia. And at the same time, we have to ask the question, some of our flora likes being in fragmented landscapes. It's speciated through being in fragmented landscapes. So is there a danger in some environments in actually joining landscapes up? So what are the dangers? So we're not sure. So, and the next slide is about celebrating our place, the wonders of this insular and ancient landscape and the extraordinary things. And I put this in because Lisa last week went like, what on earth is that? So it's a common, it's something that I'm very familiar with. And Wilson obviously was very struck by this as well, because he's got quite a few photos, and photos with man standing in it, which I think is something common. But here he's got his camera case, which I believe was about that big. So these are tall. These are very tall structures. So thank you very much. And I mean, it's in early days now of looking at my the Wilson collection, but it's been a delight, and it's been a delight being here. So thanks very much. Thank you.
Are there any questions for Margaret?
They just want their pizza.
So clearly a lot of the flowers are made internationally in the floral trade. Are there trees that are used widely in landscape architecture around the world from Australia?
Well, the eucalypts, I think. I mean, eucalypts, of course, have been big plantation trees, and you know, I can see eucalypts in California, Tunisia, France, Italy, Greece, Spain. But Eucalyptus globulus is in plantations for cut wood. Acacia is sometimes planted for different, not for, it's planted for firewood in southern Africa. But it's a very funny thing actually, that southern Africa, they don't like Australian acacias because they get in and they go like bombs. We don't like South African veldtgrass because it's got into Australia, and it's really been a problem in our landscapes in the dry southern areas. So the South Africans are quite glad that it's tit for tat sort of thing. But the acacias, the Australian acacias in southern Africa are really important because you can cut them down, they regenerate, you cut them down, they regenerate, and they're fabulous firewood plants. So that doesn't really answer your question, but the trees being exported, I don't know. I mean, I think there are problems of are you wanting to know what might be planted here or just generally? The cut flower trade, yes, a lot of them are in the cut flower trade, and a lot of eucalypts are used in the cut flower trade for their foliage, and often as infill, and particularly the grey ones.
Well, in Florida, the casuarina and the melaleuca are, were introduced. They're big invasive species.
Yes.
And in South Florida.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Melaleuca.
Oh, the melaleucas, yeah. Well, yes, they would be in sort of swampy country too in some places. Yes.
The Everglades.
Oh, is that right? Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, they're beautiful trees in situ. Yeah, yes.
Just wondering, did the rabbits invade the rabbit explosion?
Oh, the rabbits. Oh, yes.
What effect has that had on the native species?
Oh, it's had a huge impact because of disturbing the soil and undermining the soil. They've had big programs for 100 years probably, trying to eradicate the rabbits. You might have seen in one of the pictures there was a rabbit-proof fence, which was a ridiculous thing, the rabbit-proof fence. And while they were building it, there's rabbits on both sides. So, and so yeah, the undermining and mucking up the soil and eating seeds and eating young plants has been one of the major problems. And there's still a major pest, but one of the biggest pests in Australia now is a house cat. I mean, it's to our native fauna, so that's a different issue. It's not to do with botany, but the house cat has just recently, just last year, a big study done on feral cats in Australia, and they have been found to eat 361 million small marsupials a year. That's 1 million a night. And there's big programs to try and get rid of them, and a huge fencing that's been done to try and fence off areas to protect our fauna. And it protects our fauna as well. And so cats, dogs, we have feral camels, but it's the feral cats which are the big. Yeah, feral camels from the 19th century Afghan cameleers who went to Australia, and Australia exports the best racing camels in the world to Saudi Arabia, can you believe? So, yeah, sorry.
I'm just wondering, what is it in the leaves of some Australian trees that makes them look more grey?
That makes them.
Makes the colour look more grey?
Well, that's the question. I mean, I think it's probably the the structure of their cells or photosynthetic apparatus, and that is a question I'd love to know, but I'm not in a position to look at it. And they're very, very thick often. I mean, some of the leaves are really, really thick. So the eucalyptus leaves in particular are amazing because a lot of the species, if you were the sun and you were winter, then I'd be like this if I were a leaf. And if it was summer, I'd be like this. And they have a hard edge in some of the species. So there's been a lot of work looking at the anatomy in terms of oils, because these flammable oils are really amazing. I mean, if you wanted to start a fire in Australia, you can get a handful of eucalyptus leaves and so, but I don't know. I mean, it is probably a whole combination of things, and it'd be really good to know because it's remarkably different. And I you know, if I feel a London plane tree leaf, it feels very easily bruised, and a eucalypt nut. So there's a big structural difference there.
Any more questions? All right, well then let's thank her again.
Thank you.